Was it possible for the leadership of the Defense Commissariat, working through military intelligence, to detect in good time the movement of enemy troops to the Soviet borders, to the jump-off areas from which they launched their attack on June 22nd? In those conditions, this was extremely difficult. Besides, as we learned from captured maps and documents, the German command concentrated troops along the borders at the very last moment. Armoured forces, indeed, were held at a considerable distance and were not moved up to the starting points until the early morning of June 22nd. Unfortunately, even the reports we had were not always correctly interpreted, so as to provide the top leadership with a reliable and definite orientation. Here are some documents on this score from military archives. On March 20th, 1941, General Golikov, chief of the Intelligence Division, submitted a report to the leadership containing information of the greatest importance. The document outlined variants of the possible sectors where the German troops would strike when attacking the Soviet Union. As it turned out later, it accurately summarized the work on the Barbarossa plan of the German command, while one of the variants, in fact, contained the essence of the plan. The report read, "Of the most probable military operations planned against the USSR, the following merits special attention. Variant number 3, according to information, relating to February 1941. For the attack on the USSR, the message reads, 3 army groups are being set up. The first group, under the command of General Field Marshal von Bock, will strike in the direction of Petrograd. The second group, under the command of General Field Marshal von Rundstedt, in the direction of Moscow, and the third group, under the command of General Field Marshal von Leeb, in the direction of Kiev. The tentative date for beginning the attack on the USSR is May 20th. According to a message from our military attaché of March 14th, the report went on to say, a German major said, "We are changing our plan completely. We are going east against the USSR. We will seize the USSR's grain, coal and oil. Then we will be invincible and carry on with the war against England and America." Citing a message from the military attaché in Berlin, the document says that the beginning of military operations against the USSR may be expected between May 15th and June 15th, 1941. However, the conclusions drawn from the information cited in the report actually nullified its importance and misled Stalin. General Golikov ends his report as follows. 1. On the basis of all the aforesaid statements and possible variants of operations this spring, I consider that the most probable time operations will begin against the USSR is after the victory over England, or the conclusion with her of an honourable peace treaty. 2. Rumours and documents to the effect that war against the USSR is inevitable this spring should be regarded as misinformation coming from the English or perhaps even the German intelligence service. My italics, G.J. On May 6, 1941, Admiral Kuznetsov, People's Commissar for the Navy, sent the following memorandum to Stalin. Our naval attaché in Berlin, Captain First Class Vorontsov, reports that, according to a German officer from Hitler's general headquarters, the Germans are preparing to invade the USSR on May 14th through Finland, the Baltic area and Romania. Simultaneously, powerful air raids are planned on Moscow and Leningrad, and airborne troops are to be landed at border centres. The information contained in this document was also exceptionally valuable, but again Admiral Kuznetsov's conclusions were contrary to the facts he had himself cited and misinformed Stalin. He wrote, I consider that this information is false and was specially sent through this channel so that the Germans could see how the USSR would react. My italics, GG. Similar reports came from Dekhanozov, the Soviet ambassador in Germany. Not only did he send Stalin word through the appropriate channels that there was no threat of an attack, on the very eve of the war he permitted the families of many of the staff members of the embassy and trade mission to come to Berlin, and they were all arrested by the Nazis in the early hours of June 22nd. Stalin relied on all these false reports coming to him through the appropriate channels. Did the Defense Commissariat and the General Staff know anything about the reports Stalin was getting through these channels? After the war, Marshal Timoshenko assured me that he, at any rate, had known nothing about them. and I too declare as the then Chief of General Staff that I had no knowledge of them. Since the war's end, the press has come out with the version that we had knowledge of Plan Barbarossa before the war broke out, and that we knew the direction of the main strikes, the deployment frontage of the German troops, their strength and equipment. In so doing, the press referred to well-known Soviet intelligence agents, Richard Sorge for one, and many others in Switzerland, Britain, and a number of other countries, who are said to have provided this information. Yet, the press complained, our political and military leadership had not gone into the substance of the reports and had indeed rejected them. I take full responsibility for saying that this is pure fiction. As far as I know, neither the Soviet government nor the People's Commissariat for Defense nor the General Staff had any such information. Tension kept mounting, and the greater the looming threat of war, the tenser the leading personnel of the People's Commissariat for Defense and the General Staff worked. Indeed, the leading members of the Commissariat and General Staff, especially Marshal Timoshenko, worked 18 or 19 hours a day at that time, often remaining in their offices all night. On June 13th, Timoshenko phoned Stalin in my presence and asked permission to alert the troops of the border districts and to deploy the first echelons according to the cover plans. "We will think it over," Stalin replied. The next day we visited Stalin and informed him of the general anxiety and the necessity of alerting the troops. "You propose carrying out a mobilization, alerting the troops, and moving them to the western borders. But that means war. Don't you two understand that?" Still, Stalin asked, "How many divisions do we have in the Baltic, Western, Kiev, and Odessa military districts?" We informed him that by July 1st there would be 149 divisions and one separate rifle brigade in the 4 western border military districts, distributed as follows: Baltic District, 19 rifle, 4 tank, 2 motorized divisions, and 1 separate brigade. Western District, 24 rifle, 12 tank, 6 motorized, and 2 cavalry divisions. Kiev District, 32 rifle, 16 tank, 8 motorized, and 2 cavalry divisions. Odessa District, 13 rifle, 4 tank, 2 motorized, and 3 cavalry divisions. "Well, is that little?" Stalin said. "According to our information, the Germans do not have so many troops." I informed him that, according to intelligence, the German divisions were manned and armed at wartime strength. The strength of a division ranged from 14,000 to 16,000 men. Our divisions, even those of 8,000 men, were, in effect, only half as strong as the German divisions. Stalin remarked, "You can't believe everything intelligence says." During this conversation with Stalin, his secretary, Anne Poskrebyshev, came in and said NS Khrushchev was on the line from Kiev. Stalin picked up the phone. We gathered from his replies that the call concerned agriculture. "Fine," Stalin said and smiled. Evidently, Khrushchev had reported in glowing terms about the good prospects of a bumper crop. We left the Kremlin with heavy hearts. I decided to walk a little way. My thoughts were depressing. In the Alexandrov garden beside the Kremlin wall, children were romping about without a care in the world. I thought of my own little girls and realized keenly what an immense responsibility we all bore for the children, for their future, for the whole country. Every peacetime has its peculiar features, atmosphere, and charm, but I want to say a good word about those pre-war days. They were marked by a unique enthusiasm and optimism, a sort of inspiration, and at the same time a new sense of efficiency, modesty, and simplicity in relations between people. A good life, a very good life indeed, was beginning. What economist, philosopher, or writer can paint an authentic picture of how our country would flourish today, how far we would have advanced, had not war interrupted the broad, peaceful, and mighty current of those years? I have already spoken of the measures taken to avoid giving Germany a pretext to start a war. The People's Commissar for Defense, the General Staff, and the commanders of border military districts were warned that they would be held responsible for the consequences of any imprudent actions of our troops. We were categorically forbidden to move troops to the forward lines under the border cover plan without Stalin's personal permission. Commissar for Defense Timoshenko advised district commanders to hold tactical exercises in the direction of the border, thereby bringing troops closer to the deployment areas specified in the cover plans. The districts carried out the Defense Commissar's recommendation, but with one important omission. A substantial part of the artillery did not participate in the exercises. The divisional, corps and anti-aircraft artillery had not yet conducted range firing and was not ready for combat at the beginning of 1941. Consequently, the district commanders decided to send part of the artillery to ranges for practice. As a result, some corps and divisions of the covering forces were without a considerable part of their artillery when Nazi Germany attacked. On June 21st in the evening, Lieutenant General Prokhorovka, Chief of Staff of the Kiev Military District, telephoned to inform me that a German sergeant major had come to our frontier guards and said that German troops were moving to jumping-off areas and that the attack would begin on the morning of June 22nd. I immediately informed the Defense Commissar and Stalin of what Lieutenant General Prokhorovka had reported. Stalin said to come to the Kremlin with the People's Commissar. Taking with me a draft of the directive for the troops, I went to the Kremlin along with the Commissar and Lieutenant General Vatutin. On the way, we agreed that we must at all costs get permission to alert the troops. Stalin was alone when we arrived. He was plainly worried. "The German generals may have sent this turncoat to provoke a conflict," he said. "No," Timoshenko replied. "We think he is telling the truth." At that moment, members of the Politburo came in. "What are we to do?" Stalin asked. No one answered. "A directive must immediately be given to alert all troops in the border districts," Timoshenko said. "Read it," Stalin replied. I read the draft directive. Stalin said, "It's too early to issue such a directive. Perhaps the question can still be settled peacefully. We must give a short directive stating that an attack may begin with provocative actions by the German forces. The troops of the border districts must not fall for any provocation and avoid complications." Vatutin and I went into the next room and quickly drew up a draft of the directive to be sent by the People's Commissar. We then returned to the office and asked for permission to read the directive. Stalin listened to it, then read it over again, making amendments, and finally gave it to the People's Commissar to sign. In view of its importance, I cite the directive in full. To the military councils of the Leningrad, Baltic, Western, Kiev, and Odessa military districts. Copy to the People's Commissar of the Navy. 1. During the 23rd of June 41, a sudden German attack is possible on the fronts of the Leningrad, Baltic, Western, Kiev, and Odessa military districts. The attack may begin with provocative actions. 2. The task of our troops is not to be incited by any provocative action that may cause serious complications. At the same time, the troops of the Leningrad, Baltic, Western, Kiev, and Odessa military districts are to be in full combat readiness to meet a possible sudden strike by the Germans or their allies. 3. I order that A. During the early hours of the 22nd of June 41, the firing posts in fortified areas on the state border are to be secretly manned. B. Before dawn on the 22nd of June 41, all aircraft, including Army aviation, are to be dispersed among field aerodromes and carefully camouflaged. C. All units are to be put on alert. Forces are to be kept dispersed and camouflaged. D. Air defence is to be alerted without additional involvement of unit reservists. All preparations are to be made for blacking out cities and other targets. E. No other measures are to be taken without further specific orders. Vatutin took the directive to the General Staff, from where it was to be immediately transmitted to the districts. Transmission to the districts was completed at 0:30 on June 22, 1941. A copy of the directive was forwarded to the People's Commissar of the Navy. Timoshenko and I were returning from Stalin's office with an odd feeling of duality. On one hand, it seemed we had done everything we could to be prepared for the imminent military threat. A number of large-scale organizational measures were carried out to ensure mobilization. The Western military districts, which would have to be the first to engage the enemy, had been strengthened as much as possible. Lastly, we had just been authorized to issue a directive alerting the troops of the border military districts. On the other hand, the German troops could launch the offensive the next morning, while we had not completed several crucial measures. This would seriously complicate the struggle with the experienced and strong enemy. The directive that the General Staff was transmitting to the military districts at that moment could come too late. It was long since dark. The day of June 21st was drawing to a close. Timoshenko and I kept silent all the way to the commissariat, but I could feel that he was troubled by the same alarming thoughts. We alighted from the car and arranged to meet in his study in 10 minutes. On June 21st, 1941, all personnel of the General Staff and the Defence Commissariat were ordered to stay on the job overnight. The directive ordering maximum combat preparedness of frontier troops had to be promptly transmitted to the military districts. The People's Commissar for Defence and I were conducting incessant telephone conversations with the district commanders and their chiefs of staff, who reported hearing increasing noises on the other side of the border. They were getting this information from border guards and forward units covering the frontier. At about midnight, Commander of the Kiev district Kirponos reported over the high-frequency telephone, HF, from his command post at Ternopol that another German soldier had appeared in our lines besides the turncoat previously mentioned by General Pukayev. He was from the 222nd Infantry Regiment of the 74th Infantry Division. Having swum the river, he presented himself to our border guards and told them the German troops were going to mount an offensive at 4 a.m. Kirponos was ordered to speed up transmission of the alert directive to all units. Everything pointed to the German forces moving up to the frontier. At 30 minutes past midnight, we notified Stalin of this. Stalin inquired whether the directive had been sent to all districts. I replied in the affirmative. Various stories circulated after. Stalin's death that on the night of June 21st, 22, some commanders and their staffs were either peacefully asleep or making merry without a suspicion that anything was amiss. This is not true. The last night of peace was quite different. As I have already said, on our return from the Kremlin, the Commissar for Defence and I spoke over the HF with district commanders Kuznetsov, Pavlov, Kirponos and their chiefs of staff, and all of them were at their command posts. Near dawn on June 22nd, Vatutin and I were with Defence Commissar Timoshenko in his office. At 3:07 hours, I was called over the HF by Admiral F.S. Oktyabrski, commander of the Black Sea Fleet, who said that the fleet's aircraft warning system had reported the approach from the sea of large numbers of unidentified aircraft. The fleet was at full alert. The Admiral requested instructions. "What have you decided to do?" I asked him. "There is only one thing to do. Fire on the planes with the fleet's anti-aircraft batteries." After a brief exchange with Timoshenko, I said to Oktyabrski, "Act and report to your People's Commissar." At 3:30 hours, the Chief of Staff of the Western District, General V. Klimovskich, reported a German air raid on towns in Byelorussia. About 3 minutes later, the Chief of Staff of the Kiev district, General M.A. Pukayev, reported an airstrike on Ukrainian towns. At 3:40, the commander of the Baltic district, General F.I. Kuznetsov, called to report enemy air raids on Kaunas and other towns. The defense commissar said I should phone Stalin. I started calling. No one answered. I kept calling. Finally, I heard the sleep-laden voice of the general on duty at the security section. I asked him to call Stalin to the phone. "What? Now? Comrade Stalin is asleep. Wake him at once. The Germans are bombing our towns." About 3 minutes later, Stalin picked up the receiver. I reported the situation and requested permission to start retaliatory action. Stalin was silent. I heard the sound of his breathing. "Did you hear me?" Silence again. At last, Stalin asked, "Where is the defense commissar?" "Talking with the Kiev district on the HF." "You and he come to the Kremlin. Tell Poskrobyshev to summon all Politburo members." At 4 a.m., I had another talk with Admiral Oktyabrski. In a calm voice, he reported, "The enemy attack has been beaten off." The attempted strike has failed. There has been some damage in the city, however. The Black Sea Fleet under Admiral Oktyabrski was one of our first military formations to put up organised resistance to the enemy. At 4:10 hours, the Western and Baltic districts reported that the Germans had mounted armed actions on the ground. At 4:30, Timoshenko and I arrived at the Kremlin. All Politburo members were assembled. The Defence Commissar and I were called in. Stalin, his face white, was sitting at the table cradling a tobacco-filled pipe in his hand. He said, "We must immediately phone the German embassy." The embassy replied that Ambassador Count von der Schulenburg requested to be received to deliver an urgent message. Molotov was authorized to receive him. Meanwhile, the first Deputy Chief of General Staff, Vatutin, passed word that following a strong artillery barrage, German land forces had mounted an assault at several points of the northwestern and western sectors. A while later, Molotov strode into the office and said, "The German government has declared war on us." Stalin sank into his chair, deep in thought. There was a long and pregnant silence. I decided to risk breaking it and suggested crashing down on the attackers with the full strength of our frontier districts and holding up any further enemy advance. "Annihilate, not hold up," Timoshenko corrected me. "Issue a directive," said Stalin. At 7:15 hours on June 22nd, the Defence Commissar's Directive No. 2 was communicated to the districts. However, considering the balance of strength and the obtaining situation, it proved plainly unrealistic and was therefore never carried out. On returning to the Defence Commissariat, Timoshenko and I learned that just before daybreak on June 22nd, cable communication lines had been cut in all the western frontier districts. The headquarters of districts and armies had no way to promptly transmit their instructions. Specially dispatched German agents and saboteurs had been cutting cables, killing repairmen, and attacking troop commanders. As I have already said, most units in the frontier districts had no radio facilities. From various sources, district headquarters began receiving the most contradictory, frequently provocative reports. The General Staff was unable to obtain credible information from district headquarters and field commands, and this, naturally, placed the High Command and the General Staff in a very awkward situation. By 8 o'clock on June 22nd, the General Staff finally pieced together the following: a powerful enemy bomb strike, hitting airfields in the Western, Kiev, and Baltic special military districts, inflicted serious damage on our aircraft, which had been unable to take off and disperse to field airstrips. Many towns and railway junctions in the Baltic area, Byelorussia and the Ukraine, as well as the naval bases at Sebastopol and on the Baltic coast, had been bombed. Bitter fighting was ongoing against German land forces along our entire western frontier. On many sectors, the Germans had already engaged forward units of the Red Army. Alerted infantry units belonging to the first echelon covering the frontier were going into battle on the march, failing to take up prepared positions. On the sector of the Leningrad military district, things were so far quiet, and the enemy had done nothing. At about 9 o'clock, Timoshenko phoned Stalin and asked for permission to come to the Kremlin and present a draft decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet on nationwide mobilization and the establishment of the High Command Stavka, as well as on several other measures. The short distance from the Defence Commissariat to the Kremlin was covered by the Commissar's car and mine at top speed. I was accompanied by Vatutin, First Deputy Chief of General Staff, who had a map showing the strategic situation. As we drove, I was true to my old habit of checking if I had taken all the requisite papers. They were not many, but included the draft of a decision to form a High Command Stavka, the top body to direct the military operations of our armed forces. The document had been drawn up in advance by the General Staff and okayed by the Defence Commissar. We were met by Poskrobyshev, who took us at once to Stalin's office. Members of the Politburo were on the spot. The atmosphere was tense. Silence reigned in the room. Joseph Stalin was walking up and down, an unlit pipe clasped in his hand. "Well, what have you got there?" he asked. Timoshenko reported on the draft project on a High Command Stavka. Stalin looked at the paper but took no decision. He laid it on his desk and said curtly, "The Politburo will discuss it." Then he inquired about the situation and said, "Molotov is making a radio address at noon." Having read the General Staff's draft on the mobilization decree, and after reducing it in length, Stalin handed it to Poskrebyshev for approval by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. From June 23rd, reservists born in 1905 to 1918 in 14 military districts, except the Central Asian, Transbaikal, and Far Eastern districts, were to be called up, and martial law declared in the European part of the country. All functions of the state relating to defence, public order, and national security were to be taken over by the military authorities. They were authorised to enlist people and all means of transport for building fortifications and guarding major military and civilian installations. On June 22nd, the Baltic, Western, and Kiev special military districts were transformed into the northwestern, western, and southwestern fronts. At about 13 o'clock on June 22nd, Stalin telephoned me. "Our front commanders lack combat experience and are evidently a bit confused. The Politburo has decided to send you to the southwestern front as representative of the High Command. We are sending Shaposhnikov and Kulik to the Western Front. I summoned them and gave them the pertinent instructions. You are to fly to Kiev at once and then proceed to front headquarters in Ternopil together with Khrushchev." "Who is going to run the General Staff in this difficult situation?" I asked. Stalin replied, "Leave Vatutin in your place." And he added irascibly, "Don't lose time. We'll get along somehow." I phoned my family to tell them not to wait for me, and in 40 minutes I was airborne. Then only did I remember that I had had nothing to eat since yesterday. The flyers helped out, treating me to strong tea and sandwiches. By the end of the day, I was at the Central Committee of the Ukrainian Communist Party in Kiev, where Khrushchev was waiting for me. He told me it was dangerous to go any further by air. German airmen were chasing transport planes. We would go by car. Having received the latest news on the situation from Vatutin over the HF, we left for Ternopil, where Colonel General Kirponos, commander of the Southwestern Front, had his command post. We arrived at the command post late at night, and I immediately got in touch with Vatutin on the HF. Here is what he told me. By the end of June 22nd, despite vigorous measures, the General Staff had failed to receive accurate information about our forces and the enemy from Front, Army, and Air Force headquarters. The information on the depth of enemy penetration was contradictory. There was no precise data on losses in the Air Force and land forces. All he knew was that the aviation of the Western Front had sustained very heavy losses. The General Staff and the People's Commissar for Defence had been unable to make contact with front commanders Kuznetsov and Pavlov, who had gone to the troops without reporting to the Commissar for Defence. The headquarters of the fronts did not know where their commanding officers were at that moment. According to air reconnaissance, battles were being fought in our fortified zones and partially 15 to 20 kilometres inside our territory. Front headquarters could not contact local commands as there was neither cable nor radio communication with most of the armies and separate corps. Then General Vatutin told me Stalin had endorsed the Defence Commissar's draft Directive No. 3 and had ordered my signature to be affixed to it. "What directive is that?" I inquired. "The directive instructs our troops to mount a counteroffensive with the task of routing the enemy in all major directions and advancing into enemy territory. But we still don't know exactly where the enemy is striking and in what strength," I objected. "Wouldn't it be better to find out what is actually going on at the front by tomorrow morning and then adopt the requisite decision?" "I think you are right, but the thing is settled." "All right," I said. "Put down my signature." This directive was received by the commander of the Southwestern Front sometime around midnight. As I had expected, the front's chief of staff, M.8. objected sharply. He believed the front had neither manpower nor materiel to carry it out. After a detailed discussion at the Military Council of the Front, I suggested that Kirponos should, for the time being, order the mechanized corps to concentrate their forces and strike back at the enemy's major army group south, which had broken through in the Sokal area. This counterattack should be supported by the entire aviation at the disposal of the front and a portion of the High Command's long-range bomber aircraft. The command and staff of the front swiftly drafted preliminary operational instructions and communicated them to the armies and corps. Credit is due to the brilliant organizational skills and level-headedness of the Front Chief of Staff, General Perkayev. He laid down the time schedule for the planned counteroffensive and mobilized all commanders in the area to the utmost. The Southwestern Front became the first to win a combat victory over the German army. On June 23, 1941, in the vicinity of the Sokal railway station, it inflicted a sudden and devastating blow on the advancing enemy, forcing its infantry to fall back and causing panic in its ranks. The impact of the 8th Mechanized Corps on German forces. The attack by these corps, particularly the successful actions of the 8th Mechanized Corps, soon made a telling impact on the German forces. This was especially true after the rout of the Nazi 57th Infantry Division, which had been covering the right flank of the 48th Motorized Corps of von Kleist's group. A rather grave situation developed that day for the German 48th Mechanized Corps. They were compelled to throw in all their aviation to save themselves from being crushed and were forced to bring up the 44th Army Corps and other units. On that day, Colonel General Halder, Chief of Staff of German Land Forces, wrote the following in his service diary. "The enemy keeps bringing up new and fresh forces from the rear against our tank thrust. As was expected, the enemy has passed into an offensive in considerable tank strength against the southern flank of the 1st Tank Group. Troop movement has been registered on several sectors. Thus, the forces of our southwestern front successfully dealt one of their first counterblows. It could have been more powerful had the front command had greater air strength at its disposal to act in cooperation with the Mechanized Corps and at least another 1 or 2 infantry corps. While at the command post of the southwestern front, we naturally devoted our attention to the Dubno sector, the site of the main fighting in Ukraine. From a telephone conversation with the 6th Army Commander, General in Muzichenko, and the 26th Army Commander, General F.Y. Kostenko, I learned that the advancing German 17th Army had delivered its main blow in the direction of Lvov. Below is a transcript of a telephone conversation with Lieutenant General Kostenko at 10:30 to 10:55 in the morning of June 25, 1941. Zhukov. I have a few questions. Are you maintaining contact with the left flank of the 97th Rifle Division, Kostenko? Last night, I sent a squad and made contact with the division in the Yavorov area. That's the area where the 6th Corps has its HQ. Zhukov. Where is the right flank of the 99th Rifle Division? Kostenko. The right flank has now turned east of Gusaku. Zhukov. Where are your reserves, and how large are they? Kostenko. 2 regiments are about to arrive. 1 regiment, withdrawn from the front lines, is to reach Dobromil by 11 o'clock hours on the 25th, and the other, also withdrawn from the front lines, is on its way to the Sambor area and is just approaching Kirov. My reserve battalion and 12 tanks are on their way to cover Sambor in the north and reconnoitre in the direction of Mostsisk. Zhukov. Who has Peremyshal? Kostenko. It's in our hands. Zhukov. What do you think is the strength of the enemy facing you? Kostenko. The 99th Division is faced by up to 2 infantry divisions and a force of some 200 motorcycles. Along the rest of the front there are up to 2 divisions. What's more, they're mountain troops. Zhukov. Thanks. Now I know. At the moment, I'm at Comrade Kirponos's command post. Best wishes. Have you any questions? Kostenko. I want to ask the front commander to let me have at least 1 tank regiment. It's really needed. Zhukov. We'll think about it. Kostenko. Army HQ has no liaison planes. Zhukov. We'll make a note of that too, and try to find something for you. Kostenko. Do you know the situation? Zhukov. I know the situation, for I have wire communications with the 6th Army. Zhukov. Fine. Goodbye. It was clear to me that, as usual, Kostenko was sure to do the job he had been entrusted with, and would stake all his energy and ability, and his life if necessary, to do it. Captured Germans testified that after seizing Rava-Ruskaya, their command had planned to send its 14th Motorized Corps into action. The Rava-Ruskaya fortified zone had been defended from the very first minutes of the war by the 35th and 140th Separate Machine Gun Battalions, the 41st Rifle Division under Major General G.N. Mikushev, and Major Y.D. Malley's detachment of Frontier Guards. The command of the German 17th Army had deployed 5 infantry divisions in this sector. Despite the formidable shelling, airstrikes, and sustained attacks, the enemy had been unsuccessful in its bid to capture the Rava-Ruskaya fortified zone and break the resistance of the 41st Division. In the afternoon of June 22nd, the 41st Division, which incorporated 2 artillery regiments, was reinforced with the 209th Corps Artillery Regiment, armed with 152 mm guns. On that day, enemy forces sustained heavy losses without achieving their goal. The Peremyshal fortified area was held by the 52nd and 150th Separate Machine Gun Battalions and the 92nd Frontier Guard Detachment. They had occupied their emplacements by 6 o'clock in the morning of June 22nd. Together with the Frontier Guard troops and armed volunteer detachments, they were the first to be engaged by the enemy. For several hours, the gallant defenders of the city repelled the onslaught of a superior enemy force. Then the commander of the 92nd Frontier Guard Detachment ordered them to withdraw to the city's outskirts, where they once again delayed the enemy. This gave the 99th Infantry Division under Colonel N.I. Dementiev time to reach Peremyshal. On June 23rd, acting in conjunction with a composite Frontier Guard battalion, it delivered a counterblow and threw the Nazis out of the city. The Germans renewed their attacks on June 23rd, which were particularly severe on the Rava-Ruskaya sector. In some places, enemy units succeeded in penetrating the defences of the 41st Division, but thanks to firm control by General Mikushev, the enemy was thrown back to his starting positions by a successful counterattack. However, by the close of that day, the enemy dealt a powerful blow at the boundary between the Rava-Ruskaya and Peremyshal areas, defended by the 97th and 159th Rifle Divisions. The 159th, which was then being deployed, had considerable numbers of untrained reservists in its ranks, and, unable to withstand the enemy attacks, began a withdrawal, thus gravely endangering adjacent units. The countermeasures taken by the 6th Army commander, General Muzichenko, failed to remedy the situation, and by the close of June 24th, the gap in the defences was 40 kilometres wide. The Rava-Ruskaya and Peremyshal fortified areas were still successfully beating back enemy attacks. Inflicting considerable losses on the enemy, the 99th Division did not yield a single metre of its positions. For its heroic actions, the 99th was conferred the Order of the Red Banner. Equally successful was the 41st Rifle Division. It was due exclusively to the deep intrusion of sizable enemy forces in the sector defended by the 159th Division and the ensuing threat of the fortified area being outflanked that the front command ordered the 41st Division to withdraw to the rearward line of defence before dawn on June 27th. As for the 99th Rifle Division, it held Peremyshal during June 23rd, 28. Not until the morning of June 29th was it ordered by the command to abandon the city. On June 25th, 26, fighting continued with mounting intensity. The enemy threw in a powerful air force. Fierce battles were fought in the air and on the ground, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Frequently, the German airmen would simply flinch in the face of the bold attacks of our pilots and fly back to their airfields. Following the appearance of the enemy's forward units in the Dubno area, General Ryabyshev was ordered to turn his 8th Corps to confront them. The 15th Mechanized Corps engaged its main forces in the general direction of Berestechko and on to Dubno. The approaching 36th Rifle and 19th Mechanized Corps were also proceeding to the Dubno area, and fierce fighting ensued there on June 27th. The Germans immediately reinforced their troops with the 55th Army Corps, saving their Dubno group from a complete rout. Sustaining heavy losses, the enemy was compelled to withdraw forces from other sectors and move them toward Dubno. Our troops were unable to smash the enemy and arrest his advance altogether. But the main job had been done. The enemy shock force thrusting towards Kiev was held up in the Brody-Dubno area and seriously weakened. At 5 p.m. on June 24th, I spoke over a Bodo system telegraph with the commander of the Fifth Army, General M.I. Potapov. Before setting forth the substance of this conversation, I want to point out that Mikhail Potapov was a highly experienced general who had good combat training in the Khalkhin-Gol battles. He was a brave and cool-headed army commander, and it was not for nothing that the Fifth Army was very well known to the German High Command, which had felt its painful strikes on more than one occasion. I shall now briefly describe our conversation, quite typical for the first days of the war. Potapov. On the Vladova-Ustylug front, there are up to 5 infantry divisions and up to 2,000 panzers. The main group of enemy panzers is advancing on the Dubenka-Gorodlo sector. From Ustylug to Sokal, there are up to 6 infantry divisions together with the 14th Panzer Division. The main direction of this division is Vladimir-Volynski and Lutsk. On the boundary between the 5th and 6th Armies are mechanized units of undetermined strength. The enemy is levelling his main blow at Vladimir-Volynski and Lutsk, with an auxiliary strike from Brest-Litovsk towards Kovel. I am reporting the position of the Army's units as of 14:20 hours on June 24, 1941. Fedyuninsky is holding positions along the Pulemets-Kusnishchi-Vishnev-Nikitichi line. 2 regiments of his 87th Rifle Division are holding fortified points at Ustylug. They have been encircled and are short of ammunition. I have no information since yesterday about the 124th Division. The 41st Tank Division is in the Matsyov-Koshari area, putting its vehicles in order after battle. The 135th Division, in cooperation with the 19th Tank Division, and 1 regiment of the 87th Rifle Division, supported by the 1st Anti-Tank Brigade and all the Corps artillery, has been attacking in the Vladimir-Volynski direction since 14 o'clock hours. Lutsk has a perimeter defence, but it is highly ragged. What I am afraid of is a panzer strike from the south towards Lutsk, which will create the risk of a battle on 2 fronts. I have absolutely no strength with which to parry southward. I request stronger support by bombers, and that crossings of panzer units on the Dubenka-Gorodlo line should be prevented. I ask, too, that the advancing panzer units from Brest-Litovsk should be held up, and that strafers and fighters support us in destroying the enemy group in the Vladimir-Volynski area. I have no reserves. The 9th Mechanized Corps can assemble up to 200 old tanks in the Olik area no sooner than in 2 days' time. Telephone communications have been destroyed everywhere. As soon as we repair them, the enemy air force demolishes them again. I have stable radio communications with the Infantry Corps. Request instructions as to further action. Zhukov. 1. Your right-hand neighbour is fighting in the area of Pruzhany Gorodets. The advance of an enemy force from Brest towards Kovel is the result of inadequately organised action by Korobkov. You will turn your flank towards Brest-Litovsk and seal off the approaches to Kovel. 2. Musichenko is fighting successfully north of Kamenka-Strumilovskaya and Rava-Ruskaya, and further along the state border. Having sent in a formidable panzer group, the enemy has slashed the junction between the 5th and 6th Armies and is out to capture Brody. 3. Karpetso and Ryabyshev are dealing counterblows in the following directions. Karpetso through Brody to the northwest, with the fighting now apparently going on about 15 kilometres northwest of Brody. Ryabyshev is to the left and pointing northward. This manoeuvre will assist you. The objective of the counterblow is to smash the enemy in the area of Brody-Kristinopol and further north, thereby allowing you to assemble units and organise a stable front. To the north and south of Lutsk, the 19th and 9th Mechanized Corps, along with 2 infantry corps, will be brought into action to reinforce your group. Measures will be taken regarding aviation. Nothing has been received from you by radio or decoded. We will dispatch an expert by plane to determine the reason for the technical differences in radio transmission and coding. I repeat, seal off all approaches to Kovel from the north. Don't send your infantry divisions into counterattacks without tanks, as this will be of no avail. It is essential to help the 87th Rifle Division with shells and other ammunition. See if you can possibly get it out of the encirclement at night. How are your KV and other tanks doing? Do they pierce German armour? And approximately how many panzers has the enemy lost on your front? Potapov. I have under my command the 14th Air Division, which had 41 planes as of this morning. The order issued by the front states we are covered by the 62nd and 18th Bomber Divisions. I have no information about their whereabouts and no contact with them. I have 30 large KV tanks, but there are no shells for their 152mm guns. I have T-26 and BT tanks, mainly of old models, including some with twin turrets. We have destroyed up to 100 enemy panzers. Your order is clear. I have one fear. Will I be in time to bend Fedyuninsky's right flank and securely seal off approaches from the north? After all, enemy panzers have now reached the Ratno area. In any case, I will do my best to carry out your order. Zhukov. The KV's 152mm gun takes 09, 30 ammunition, so order the immediate issue of 09, 30 concrete piercing shells and use them. You'll give the panzers a hell of a pasting. As for everything else, we'll organize assistance. I am relying on you and Nikishev very much. I'll come and see you tonight or tomorrow. Goodbye. To continue the offensive towards Kiev, the German command had to transfer a sizable force and hundreds of panzers from the strategic reserves to replenish von Kleist's units. If the units of the southwestern front had succeeded in organizing better land and air reconnaissance, as well as closer liaison and troop control, the result of the counterblow would have been even more effective. In these battles, a great deal of credit must go to the 22nd Mechanized Corps under Major General S.M. Kondrusev, the 27th Rifle Corps of the 5th Army under Major General P.D. Artemenko, and the 8th Mechanized Corps under D.I. Ryabyshev. The operations of the 8th Mechanized Corps could have yielded even better results had the Corps commander not divided the Corps into two groups and handed over command of one group to Commissar N.K. Popel, who lacked adequate tactical training to control a large-scale engagement. The 15th Mechanized Corps under General Karpetso fell short of its capacity, which was quite considerable for that time in carrying out its task. For some reason, our historians seem to treat this truly great frontier battle in the initial period of the war against Nazi Germany in general outline only. It would be highly desirable to make a detailed analysis of the tactical expediency in this phase of a counterattack, using mechanized corps against the breakthrough of the main group of enemy troops, as well as the organization of the counterattack itself. After all, it was thanks to these actions of our troops that the enemy plan of a swift thrust to Kiev was thwarted at the outset. Having sustained heavy losses in this fighting, the enemy learned of the staunchness of the Soviet soldiers who were prepared to fight to the last drop of their blood. Of considerable interest is the evaluation of this battle offered in the reminiscences of General Hoth, former commander of the German 3rd Panzer Group. The worst of the fighting fell to the lot of Army Group South. Enemy forces on the defensive against the formations of the northern wing were pushed back from the frontier, but soon succeeded in getting over the surprise and checked the advance of the German forces by counterattacks of reserves and tank units from rearward areas. The tactical breakthrough of the 1st Panzer Group attached to the 6th Army was not achieved until June 28th. A formidable obstacle hindering the advance of German forces were the powerful enemy counterblows. From my phone talks during those days with General Vatutin in Moscow, I learned that on the western and northwestern fronts, the commanding generals and their staffs still had no reliable communications with the commanders of armies. Our divisions and corps had to fight in isolation, without cooperation with the neighbouring troops and aviation, and without proper direction from the centre. It became clear to me from Vatutin's reports that an exceptionally difficult situation had developed on the western and northwestern fronts. Vatutin told me that Stalin was perturbed and tended to blame everything on the command and staff of the Western Front. He was accusing Marshal Kulik of inactivity. Marshal Shaposhnikov, who was at the headquarters of the Western Front, reported that Kulik had been at the headquarters of the Third Army on the morning of June 23rd, but communications with it had been cut off. Some time later, however, the General Staff managed to learn from various sources that large-scale enemy groups of armoured and mechanized forces had broken through in several sectors of both fronts and were swiftly moving into Byelorussia and the Baltic area. Thus began the grim trials of the Soviet people. In recent years, it has become common to blame the command for not having ordered our main forces to pull up from the interior to repulse the enemy. I do not venture to state what would have happened if this had been done, whether the result would have been better or worse. It is quite possible that, being under-equipped with anti-tank and anti-aircraft facilities, and being less mobile than the enemy, our troops may have failed to withstand the powerful slashing thrusts of the enemy panzer forces, and may therefore have found themselves in as grave a predicament as some of the armies of the frontier districts. How can one tell what may then have developed at the approaches to Moscow and Leningrad, and in the south of the country? It will only be fair to add that the Nazi command had seriously counted on our rushing the main forces of the fronts closer to the frontier, where it planned to encircle and destroy them. That, indeed, was the main objective of Plan Barbarossa at the start of the war. Early in the morning on June 26th, General Vatutin called me at the command post in Ternopil. In the Baltic area and Byelorussia, he informed me, the situation was extremely unfavourable. The 8th Army of the Northwestern Front was withdrawing towards Riga, the 11th Army was fighting its way towards Polotsk, the 21st Mechanized Corps was being rushed from the Moscow military district to reinforce the front. Stalin had ordered the activation of a reserve front, which was to be deployed on the Sushchevo-Nevel-Vitebsk-Mogilev, Zhlobin-Gomel-Chernigov, the Desna-Dnieper line. It would incorporate the 19th, 20th, 21st and 22nd Armies. Basically, this was the line People's Commissar Timoshenko and I, along with a group of General Staff officers, had reconnoitred in May, planning to hold staff exercises there to verify our projects for troop control on an operational scale. In those days, neither the front commands, nor the High Command, nor the General Staff had complete enough information about the enemy forces deployed against our fronts. The General Staff was receiving plainly exaggerated intelligence from the fronts about the enemy's panzer, air, and motorized units. Today, when we have all but exhaustive information about the strength of both sides, we can fill in the picture and take stock of the Soviet forces in the frontier military districts, and then of the deployment of the German forces that invaded our country. No few articles and books have been written on this subject already, but in several cases they are tendentious and lack the necessary expertise. They inform us that on the eve of the war, 170 Soviet divisions were dispersed over a vast territory with a frontage of nearly 4,500 kilometres from the Barents to the Black Sea, with the depth of troop dispositions spanning 400 kilometres, without the density on the crucial sectors essential to repulse the enemy. That was not exactly the case. The distance between the Barents Sea and the Black Sea does total 4,500 kilometres, but only if the entire shoreline covered by the coast defences and the Navy is added to the land border covered by the 5 military frontier districts. As it happened, there were no troops at all along the Gulf of Finland shore from Tallinn to Leningrad. The 170 Soviet divisions, therefore, really manned 3,375 kilometres. Along the land border, the troop density of the various groupings differed, depending on local conditions and the strategic importance of each sector. The Northern Front, Leningrad Military District, stretching over 1,275 kilometres, was covered by just 21 divisions and 1 infantry brigade. Thus, each division had an average frontage of 61 kilometres. Deployed along the 2,100 kilometres frontage of the Special Baltic, Special Western, Special Kiev and Odessa districts were 149 divisions and 1 brigade. In this crucial sector, the average per division was just a little over 14 kilometres. Those are the facts. On the eve of the war, these forces were stationed as follows. The Special Baltic Military District, Commanding Officer, Colonel General F.I. Kuznetsov, Military Council Member, Corps Commissar P.A. Dibrova, Chief of Staff, Major General P.S. Klenov, had 25 divisions, including 4 tank, 2 mechanized, and 1 infantry brigade. The Special Western Military District, Commanding Officer, General of the Army D.G. Pavlov, Military Council Member, Corps Commissar A.F. Fominik, Chief of Staff, Major General V.E. Klimovskich, had 24 infantry, 12 tank, 6 mechanized, and 2 cavalry divisions. The Special Kiev Military District, Commanding Officer, Colonel General M.P. Kirponos, Military Council Member, Division Commissar Y.P. Rykov, Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General A.M. Perkayev, had 32 infantry, 16 tank, 8 mechanized, and 2 cavalry divisions. The Odessa Military District, Commanding Officer, Lieutenant General Y.T. Cherevichenko, Military Council Member, Corps Commissar A.F. Kolobiakov, Chief of Staff, Major General M.V. Zakharov, had 13 infantry, 4 tank, 2 mechanized, and 3 cavalry divisions. The strongest grouping of our forces was thus deployed in the southwestern sector, Kiev and Odessa military districts. It was manned by 45 infantry, 20 tank, 10 mechanized, and 5 cavalry divisions. Out of the 149 divisions and 1 brigade in the 4 western border districts, 48 divisions were attached to the 1st covering echelon and were deployed 10 to 50 kilometers from the state frontier, the infantry divisions closer, the tank divisions further inland. The main forces of the frontier districts were positioned at a distance of 80 to 300 kilometers inland from the state frontier. The flanks of the coastal military districts were covered by the navy and the coastal defences, which consisted mainly of artillery. Directly along the actual frontier were the Frontier Guard units of the NKVD. I have already cited some of the reasons for our reverses at the beginning of the war. References to other reasons will still arise, but I want to say loud and clear at this point that the errors made by the leadership do not lift the blame for blunders and misjudgments from the military command of all levels. No military leader who has erred can have any moral right to shirk his responsibility or shift the blame to his superiors. The troops and their commanders should, as the regulations prescribe, be prepared to carry out their combat mission in any situation. Yet, on the eve of the war, and even after dark on June 21st, some ranking commanders of formations making up the frontier covering echelon waited for instructions from their superiors up to the last moment, and did not hold their units in combat readiness, although the sound of engines and the clanging of caterpillar tracks could already be heard on the other side of the border. The German High Command committed 153 divisions of wartime strength against the Soviet troops, including 29 against the Baltic, 50, including 15 Panzer divisions against the Western Front, 33, including 9 Panzer and motorized, divisions against the Kiev district, and 12 against the Odessa district. Up to 5 divisions were in Finland, and 24 divisions were in reserve and advanced in the main strategic directions. These facts came to our knowledge in the initial phase of the war, mainly through prisoners of war and captured documents. Shortly before the war, Stalin, the People's Commissar for Defense, and the General Staff believed that the Nazi command would keep no less than 50% of its troops and air force in the West and the occupied countries. In actual fact, at the time it started the war against the Soviet Union, the Nazi command left less than 1/3 of its divisions in those areas, and second-rate ones at that, and soon reduced even that figure. In its army groups north, centre and south, the enemy sent into action 4,300 tanks and assault guns. The land forces were supported by 4,980 combat aircraft. The invasion force had an almost twofold edge over our artillery, with the enemy's artillery being mostly motorized. Looking back to those first days of the war, I have endeavoured to pinpoint and analyse the tactical and strategic mistakes committed by the military, the People's Commissar for Defence, the General Staff and the district commands, on the eve and immediately after the start of the war. We did not foresee the large-scale surprise offensive launched at once by all available forces, which had been deployed in advance in all major strategic directions. We did not envisage the nature of the strike in its entirety. Neither the People's Commissar nor I, nor my predecessors B.M. Shaposhnikov and K.A. Meretskov, nor the top officers of the General Staff had expected the enemy to concentrate such huge numbers of armour and motorised troops and commit them on the first day to action in powerful compact groupings in all strategic directions, with the aim of striking powerful wedging blows. Another thing. Just before the war, the 10th Army and some other units of the Western District were positioned in the Belostok Bulge, which was bent outward towards the enemy. The 10th Army was in a particularly unfavourable position. This tactical configuration exposed its defenders to deep envelopment and encirclement from the directions of Grodno and Brest, by means of a blow at its flanks. In the meantime, the deployment of our troops in the Grodno, Suwalki and Brest directions was not deep and powerful enough to prevent a breakthrough and the envelopment of the Belostok group. This error made in 1940 was not remedied by the start of hostilities. When the main forces of the enemy crushed the flanks of the covering troops and broke through at Grodno and Brest, the 10th Army and the adjacent flanks of the 3rd and 4th should have been swiftly withdrawn to escape encirclement and transferred to rear lines of defence in vulnerable sectors, where they could have greatly reinforced our resistance. This was not done, however. A similar mistake was repeated with the armies of the Southwestern Front, which too were being belatedly withdrawn to escape the threat of encirclement. All this showed that at that time none of us yet had sufficient experience in troop control in the complex conditions of fierce, large-scale fighting on a vast stretch of land. Mention should also be made of yet another mistake made by the High Command and the General Staff, which I have already partially referred to. This was the counteroffensive envisioned in Directive No. 3. When the High Command ordered that counteroffensive, it did not know the situation that had shaped by the close of June 22nd. Neither did the various front commands know the true state of affairs. The High Command based its decision not on an analysis of the obtaining situation and not on verified estimates, but on intuition and a desire to act. It failed to take the capability of the troops into account, and that is totally impermissible at crucial moments in an armed struggle. The only correct mode of action in the obtaining situation was to strike back with mechanized corps against the thrusting panzer groups. Most of the counterattacks that were attempted were poorly organized and, lacking due cooperation and support, failed to achieve their objective. There was another factor that affected our fighting capacity during the first days. Some army commanders, instead of organizing steady control from their command posts and maintaining contact with their neighbors, with front headquarters and with the Air Force, rushed from unit to unit, giving instructions without a knowledge of the situation in other sectors. Thereby, the commanding officers of units and formations were placed in a tight spot. Lacking stable communications with their superior commands, they were forced to act at their own discretion, in any way they thought fit, quite frequently to the detriment of adjacent units. The disorderly withdrawal of the 3rd Army from the Grodno area and the 4th Army from the Brest area drastically worsened the situation for the 10th Army commanded by Major General K.D. Golubev. Without overly strong enemy pressure, the 10th Army, entrenched in the Osovets fortified area, was still fighting. Lieutenant General the 4th Boldin, Deputy Commander of the Western Front, went to that area and took charge of the mounted and mechanized group of the 6th and 11th Mechanized Corps and of elements of the 6th Cavalry Corps. On June 23rd, a counterattack was mounted from the Suwalki Bulge at the flank of the enemy. It failed because Boldin was not able to concentrate all his forces for action, owing to the dispersal of the various formations and the unsatisfactory state of communications. On that day, in fact, only the 11th Mechanized Corps, under Major General D.K. Mostovenko, operated effectively. The 6th Mechanized Corps, commanded by Major General M.G. Katskilevich, on the defensive as part of the 10th Army along the Narev River, was unable to concentrate in good time for the counterattack. Valuable time was lost in disengaging and reassembling it. Units of the 6th Cavalry Corps, commanded by Major General N.S. Nikitin, were held up on the march, being continuously harassed by enemy airstrikes and suffering heavy losses. Throughout June 24th, there was bitter fighting in the Grodno area. Despite air superiority, the enemy found himself in a critical situation. The command of Army Group Center was compelled to rush in another 2 Army Corps and to turn several units of the 3rd Panzer Group. Bloody battles continued throughout the 25th too, but due to inadequate material and technical supplies, the counter-attacking group was unable to wage effective offensive action. In the course of the fighting, it sustained considerable losses and began to withdraw. Owing to fuel shortages, the tankmen were unable to remove all of their vehicles from the battlefield. Corps Commander M.G. Katskilevich was killed in this battle. He had been a good officer and a brave man. We were close friends for many years, ever since serving together in the Cavalry Inspectorate in the early 1930s. General N.S. Nikitin, who wholly merited his reputation as an intelligent, strong-willed and gallant cavalry corps commander, also fell in that battle. The spearhead of the strongest group of German land and air forces in our western strategic direction was aimed at Moscow. Operating against our western front was Army Group Center, which consisted of 2 field armies, 4th and 9th, and 2 panzer groups, 2nd and 3rd. It was supported by the 2nd Air Fleet, which incorporated an entire corps of dive bombers, and was well provided with high command artillery, motorized, engineer and construction units, and formidable auxiliary material. On all the sectors of their major strikes, the German forces had built up a 5- or 6-fold superiority. Operations by the main forces were continuously supported by airstrikes. A grave situation developed in the Brest area. Yet the enemy was unable to crush the resistance of the garrison of the Brest fortress, where the beleaguered troops put up a heroic resistance. For the Germans, the defence of Brest came as a complete surprise. The panzer forces of Guderian's group and the 4th German Field Army were compelled to bypass the city and the fortress. The troops of our 4th Army, commanded by Major General A. Korobkov, sustained a blow of no smaller force than that which befell the 3rd Army under Lieutenant General 6th Kuznetsov in the Grodno area. But being in possession of heroic Brest and controlling the 22nd Tank Division and the 6th, 42nd, 49th and 75th Rifle Divisions, the command of the 4th Army ought to have conducted its defensive operations in a more organized way. Unfortunately, this was not the case, even though the Army command was allocated the 14th Mechanized Corps. What was going on at that time on the distant approaches to Minsk? Uninformed of the true state of affairs in the 3rd, 10th and 4th Armies, and not being fully aware of the enemy panzer breakthrough, Front Commander General of the Army D.G. Pavlov took several decisions that were not in keeping with the situation. The troops of the 3rd, 10th and 4th Armies had suffered great losses in the border fighting and were pulling back eastward while courageously holding the eager enemy at bay. 4 divisions of the 13th Army were also heroically fighting delaying battles. On June 26th and 27 they fought in the Minsk fortified area. On the High Command's directive, General of the Army Pavlov ordered the 3rd and 10th Armies to withdraw eastward and occupy a defence line running from Lida to Slonim and farther on to Pinsk. But the order could not be carried out because both armies were semi-encircled, fatigued, and were making arduous headway under the continuous battering of German planes and panzers. On June 26th, the German 39th Motorized Corps approached the Minsk fortified area. Here it was met by units of the Soviet 44th Rifle Corps under General V.A. Yushkevich, which were moving towards the same area. To strengthen the defences of Minsk in the direction of Molodechno, the 2nd Rifle Corps under Major General A.N. Yermakov was urgently moved to the city's northwestern approaches. It incorporated the 100th and 161st Divisions. However, when the 47th Motorized Corps of Guderian's Panzer Group came to the southwestern approaches of Minsk, the situation of the city's defenders deteriorated sharply. The enemy was bombing Minsk savagely. The city was enveloped in flames. Thousands of its peaceful inhabitants hurled curses at the Nazi flyers as they died. Stubborn fighting was underway at the near approaches to Minsk. Special credit must go to units of the 64th, 100th and 161st Rifle Divisions. They destroyed over 100 enemy panzers and killed thousands of Nazis. On June 26th, Stalin phoned me at the command post of the Southwestern Front in Ternopil and said, A bad situation has developed on the Western Front. The enemy has approached Minsk. Something incomprehensible is happening to Pavlov. Nobody knows Marshal Kulik's whereabouts. Marshal Shaposhnikov is ill. Can you fly to Moscow at once? I'll discuss further action with comrades Kirponos and Perkayev right away, I said, and then go to the aerodrome. Late in the evening of June 26th, I landed in Moscow and went directly to Stalin's office from the airport. In Stalin's office, I saw Commissar for Defense Timoshenko and Lieutenant General Vatutin, my first deputy, standing stiffly at attention. Both of them were pale and drawn, their eyes red from lack of sleep. Stalin was not at his best either. With a brief nod, he said, "Put your heads together and tell me what can be done in the existing situation." He flung a map of the Western Front on the table. I told him we would need about 40 minutes to get our bearings. "Very well. Report to me in 40 minutes, Stalin rejoined. We went to an adjacent room and began discussing the situation and our capabilities on the Western Front. The situation there was indeed exceedingly grave. The remnants of the 3rd and 10th Armies were surrounded west of Minsk and fighting an unequal battle, tying down a sizable enemy force. Some units of the 4th Army had withdrawn to the Pripyat forests. Scattered formations, which had sustained serious losses in previous battles, were pulling back to the Berezina River from the Dokshitsy-Smolovichi-Slutsk-Minsk line. These weakened troops of the Western Front were being pursued by powerful enemy groups. Having discussed the situation, we could think of nothing better than to suggest urgently deploying the 13th, 19th, 20th, 21st and 22nd Armies to defend the western Dvina-Polotsk-Vitebsk-Orsha-Mogilev-Mozyr line. Furthermore, defences were to be organised immediately on a rearward line running through Selizharovo, Smolensk, Roslavl, Gomel by the 24th and 28th Armies of the High Command Reserve. In addition, we suggested that 2 or 3 more armies should be formed out of the divisions of the Moscow Volunteer Home Guard. All these proposals were approved by Stalin and instantly put into effect through appropriate instructions. In our proposals, we were proceeding from the prime task of building up a defence in depth at the approaches to Moscow, continuously harrying the enemy and checking his advance on one of the lines of defence, and then organising a counteroffensive with troops brought in for this purpose from the Soviet Far East, and chiefly with newly activated formations. Where could the enemy be stopped? What should be the advantageous line for the counteroffensive, and what forces could be mustered? We did not know. So far, all this was nothing but an idea. On June 27th at 10:05 hours, I telegraphed the High Command order to General V.B. Klimovsky, Chief of Staff of the Western Front. It read as follows: Zhukov, you will now receive an order of the High Command. Your task is 1. Urgently locate all units, get in touch with commanders, and explain the situation, the position of the enemy, and of your own troops, detailing all locations where forward enemy mechanized units have broken through. Indicate the whereabouts of our surviving depots of fuel, ammunition, food, and fodder, so that the units obtain all they need for battle from those depots. Set the units either the objective of engaging the enemy or of concentrating in forest areas. In the latter case, indicate routes and groupings. 2. Verify which units need to be supplied fuel and ammunition by air, so as not to abandon costly materiel, notably heavy tanks and heavy artillery. 3. Withdraw all remaining troops in 3 directions, through Dokshitsy and Polotsk, to be assembled behind the Lapel and Polotsk fortified areas, the Minsk direction, the units to be assembled behind the Minsk fortified area, the 3rd direction, Glusk forests and towards Bobruisk. 4. Bear in mind that the enemy's first mechanized echelon has far outrun its infantry. This is now the weak point of the enemy, with both the forward echelon and the infantry advancing without tank support. If the commanders under you can muster their troops, particularly the tank units, a crushing blow can be delivered to smash the first echelon and rout the infantry moving without tanks. If possible, first mount a powerful blow at the rear of the enemy's first mechanized echelon advancing on Minsk and Bobruisk, after which you could most effectively turn against the infantry. Such courageous action would reflect glory on the troops of the Western District. The success will be particularly great if you manage to mount a night attack on the mechanized units. 5. Cavalry is to be withdrawn to the Pinsk forests, and bold and extensive attacks are to be mounted against the rear and combat units of the enemy. Isolated small groups of cavalry commanded by loyal and gallant commanders should be deployed on all roads. At 2 a.m. on June 28th, I had another conversation by direct line with General Klimovsky. Let me cite a few extracts. Zhukov. Report what you know about the 3rd, 10th and 4th Armies. In whose hands is Minsk and where is the enemy? Minsk is still ours. An airborne landing has been reported in the Minsk-Smolovichi area. The 44th Rifle Corps is taking steps to wipe out the landing force in the Minsk area. The enemy air force has been bombing the Borisov-Orsha railway nearly all day. There has been damage to stations and to the track. We have been unable to establish radio contact with the Third Army. According to the latest reports, the enemy has approached the fortified area. Baranovichi, Bobruisk and Pukhovichi were in our hands as of last night. Zhukov. Where are Kulik, Boldin and Korobkov? Where are the mechanized corps and the cavalry corps? Klimovsky. There have been no tidings from Kulik or Boldin. We are in touch with Korobkov. He is at his command post east of Bobruisk. Katskilevich's troops were moving up to Baranovichi and Akliustin's troops to Stolbetsy. People's Commissar for Defense. Timoshenko was appointed commander of the Western Front, with Lieutenant General A.I. Yeremenko as his deputy. To reinforce the Western Front, the armies of the Reserve Front were given over to it. On the Northwestern Front, the situation continued to deteriorate sharply. The 8th and 11th Armies, which had escaped encirclement, were now retreating in diverging directions with great losses due to poor organization by the Front Command. To cover the Peskov-Leningrad direction, the High Command ordered General Lelyushenko, commander of the 21st Mechanized Corps, to move up from the Opochka-Idritsa area towards Daugavpils to prevent the enemy from forcing the western Dvina. This objective, however, was clearly belated, for the enemy had already forced the western Dvina on June 26th and captured Daugavpils. Nonetheless, the 21st Mechanized Corps undertook a bold counteroffensive, hitting the German 56th Motorized Corps and checking its advance. Recalling this battle, Field Marshal von Manstein, then in command of the 56th Corps, wrote in his book Lost Victories. Soon we were forced to defend ourselves on the northern bank of the Dvina against enemy attacks supported by one tank division. On some sectors, things were becoming critical. However, under the pressure of superior forces and airstrikes, the 21st Mechanized Corps was compelled to withdraw and go on the defensive, holding its positions and beating off enemy attacks until July 2nd. Later, the 21st was incorporated into the 27th Army, commanded by Major General Eni Bazarin, who at the end of the war headed the heroic 5th Army of the First Byelorussian Front, which lunged into Berlin and who became the city's first commandant. It also gives me pleasure to commend the brilliant actions and fighting gallantry of the 46th Tank Division under Colonel V.A. Koptsov, a hero of Khalkhin Gol, which was a component of the 21st Mechanized Corps. At the end of the month, Stalin made new changes in the military leadership. On June 30th, Lieutenant General Vatutin was appointed Chief of Staff of the Northwestern Front. On July 2nd, under the pressure of enemy forces, the 27th Army began a withdrawal. All this time it had been fighting on a broad frontage and lacked the strength and means to organize a deeply echeloned defense. Due to the belated approach of our reserves to the Velikaya River, the enemy captured Pskov on the march. The 8th Army of the Northwestern Front lost contact with other troops and was withdrawing northward. In the first 18 days of the war, the Northwestern Front had lost Lithuania, Latvia, and a slice of the Russian Federation, creating the threat of the enemy taking Luga and emerging right at the doorstep of Leningrad. The approaches to Leningrad were still inadequately fortified and poorly protected. During this period, the General Staff received no clear and exhaustive dispatches from the staff of the Northwestern Front regarding the position of its troops, the deployment of the enemy, or the location of its panzer and motorized forces. At times we had to judge developments by conjecture, a method that is no guarantee against mistakes.